When James discovers his wife Jenna's affair with their trusted neighbor, his world is shattered. Determined to protect his family and reclaim his dignity, he embarks on a methodical journey of discovery and revenge, gathering evidence and confronting the lies that have infiltrated his marriage. But just as he begins to take control, a shocking twist plunges both of them into a tragedy neither could foresee. As their carefully constructed lives unravel, James is forced to confront the devastating consequences of betrayal, love, and loss in this gripping tale of heartbreak, revenge, and redemption. It began subtly, as many betrayals do, hidden in the quiet spaces of everyday life. Jenna and I had been married for 14 years, and while we weren't the picture-perfect couple, I thought we were solid. A good partnership, I told myself. We had a comfortable home, 2 kids we adored, and a shared history that tethered us through every storm. But tethering doesn't equal trust, and I would soon learn how easily it could snap. That Thursday started like any other. I was in the kitchen, juggling the chaos of breakfast, pancakes sizzling, the kids squabbling over the syrup, and Jenna breezing in, perfectly polished as usual. She was wearing her sharpest suit, the one that accentuated her curves just enough to make a statement but not so much as to invite questions at the office. Her perfume, a soft floral, was heavier than usual. "I've got an early client meeting," she said, brushing past me to grab her travel mug of coffee. "Don't wait up tonight. We're doing a dinner thing afterward, so I might be late." "Big client?" I asked, flipping a pancake and eyeing her over my shoulder. "Potentially huge," she said, flashing a tight smile. "Cross your fingers for me." I nodded, noting how her words danced on the line between truth and something else. Jenna had always been ambitious, her career in real estate a testament to her drive. She thrived on big deals and bigger paychecks, and I admired that about her. But something about her energy felt off. That suspicion hung around me like a shadow all day, refusing to leave. It wasn't until that evening, as I tidied the car while waiting for her to come home, that the shadow began to take form. The kids were asleep, the house was quiet, and I was sorting through the clutter in our SUV, discarded receipts, empty water bottles, and the usual detritus of family life. That's when I found it. Tucked between the seats was a small, unopened packet of condoms. My mind reeled. We hadn't used them in years. Jenna had been on the pill since before our first child was born. I picked it up like it might burn me and sat there in the dim light of the garage, staring at it as if it might explain itself. It didn't. When Jenna finally came home, it was after 11. She was glowing in a way that had nothing to do with a successful client dinner. I didn't confront her. Not then. Instead, I slipped the packet into my pocket and pretended everything was fine. But it wasn't. The next morning, Jenna was back to her usual self, efficient, cheerful, and completely unreadable. I played along, but my mind was working overtime. By lunchtime, I had made a decision. I wasn't going to sit back and wait for the truth to come to me. I was going to find it. That night, after Jenna went to bed, I stayed up and installed a tracking app on her phone. I told myself it wasn't about spying. It was about clarity. If there was nothing to find, then I'd know my suspicions were just paranoia. But if there was something, well, I wasn't sure what I'd do then. For a few days, nothing happened. Jenna's routine was as predictable as ever: work, errands, the occasional yoga class. I began to think I'd made a mistake, that the condoms were some weird, unexplainable anomaly. Then came the first notification. She wasn't at her office. She wasn't at a client's home. She was at a boutique hotel downtown. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. The little dot that represented her location sat still, mocking me. My mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Maybe she was meeting a client in the lobby. Maybe she was attending a networking event. But deep down, I knew. I drove to the hotel. It wasn't the kind of place where you met clients, it was the kind of place where discretion was part of the price tag. I parked across the street and waited, watching the entrance like a man possessed. An hour passed before I saw her. She came out laughing, her arm brushing against Mark's, our neighbor and friend. They walked close, like magnets drawn to each other, and my stomach churned. I felt 1,000 things at once: anger, betrayal, sadness, but above all, a cold determination. I didn't confront them. Not there. Not yet. I watched them get into Mark's car and drive off, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly it felt like it might snap. Back at home, I didn't sleep. Instead, I combed through the phone records, bank statements, anything that might give me the full picture. The patterns were there, hiding in plain sight. Dinner dates disguised as work meetings. Weekend getaways dressed up as conferences. And Mark's number, popping up again and again. When Jenna returned the next morning, I acted as though nothing was wrong. She kissed me on the cheek, thanked me for holding down the fort, and started making pancakes for the kids. It was almost impressive, the way she slipped back into her role as if nothing had happened. But I knew better now. And I wasn't going to let it slide. I spent the next week preparing, gathering evidence, and planning my next move. If Jenna wanted to play games, she was about to learn that I wasn't just a pawn. I was the one flipping the board. The evidence was piling up like bricks in a wall, and with each new revelation, my resolve grew stronger. I wasn't just suspicious anymore, I knew. Jenna's betrayal wasn't a fleeting mistake or a moment of weakness. It was calculated, deliberate, and ongoing. But knowing wasn't enough. I needed proof that couldn't be refuted, a weapon to ensure that when the moment came, I held all the power. The nights were long, my mind racing with every possibility. Confronting her too soon might lead to denial or manipulation. No, I would wait until the moment was right. A week later, Jenna announced she'd be away for another overnight conference. My stomach churned at the ease with which she lied. I smiled and nodded, playing the role of the clueless husband. As soon as she left, I called my lawyer. I'd already begun freezing joint accounts, but now I wanted to discuss custody and the house. Jenna wouldn't just lose my trust, she would lose everything. But the waiting gnawed at me. Sitting at home, pretending life was normal, felt unbearable. I needed to see her betrayal with my own eyes. So, I tracked her phone to another hotel and drove there, parking a few blocks away. The hotel lobby was quiet, the kind of place that promised discretion to its patrons. I sat in my car for an hour, waiting and watching, before I saw them. Jenna and Mark walked out together, laughing, their body language screaming intimacy. He had his hand on her back, guiding her to his car. She leaned into him like they were the only two people in the world. I snapped photos, my hands steady despite the fury boiling inside me. These weren't just memories, I was building my case. The next morning, Jenna returned home with her usual excuses, carrying coffee and croissants as if that would mask the scent of infidelity clinging to her. It was a long night, she said, dropping her bag on the counter. These conferences always drag on. I nodded, barely looking up from the paper. Must have been exhausting. You have no idea. She kissed me on the cheek, the kind of kiss that felt more like a dismissal than affection. I wanted to scream at her, to demand answers, but I held my tongue. Instead, I watched her go through her routine, all smiles and small talk, while my mind churned with plans. That evening, I decided to dig deeper into Mark's life. He was a neighbor, someone we'd shared barbecues and beers with. The betrayal felt sharper because of that familiarity. Using his phone number, which was already all over Jenna's call log, I found his social media accounts and dug through his online presence. Mark was married. His wife, Lisa, was kind and unassuming, the type of person who baked cookies for neighborhood block parties. She had no idea that the man she trusted was tearing apart two families. The thought made me sick. I considered telling her right then and there, but I hesitated. Lisa deserved the truth, but I wasn't ready to blow the lid off this yet. Timing was everything. 2 days later, the perfect opportunity presented itself. Jenna mentioned she'd be attending a friend's party on Saturday, one I hadn't been invited to. "It's just a girls' night," she explained, waving it off. "You wouldn't enjoy it." I nodded, feigning disinterest. "Have fun." Saturday arrived, and as soon as she left, I followed her. Sure enough, she wasn't heading to a party with friends, she was heading to Mark's house. His car was parked in the driveway, and I could see the silhouette of the two of them through the living room window. My hands shook as I took pictures, each snap of the camera feeling like a nail in the coffin. I returned home and began compiling everything I had: photos, screenshots, call logs. Each piece of evidence was a weapon, sharpened and ready. By the time Jenna returned, I had a manila envelope stuffed with her lies. She walked in around midnight, looking flushed and happy. "The party was great," she said, kicking off her heels. "I'm glad you had fun," I replied, my voice even. "We need to talk tomorrow morning." Her smile faltered for a moment, but she nodded. "Sure. Is everything okay?" "Just some things we need to sort out," I said, keeping my tone light. Inside, I was a storm waiting to unleash itself. The next morning, I handed her the envelope over breakfast. The kids were still asleep, and the house was quiet except for the ticking of the kitchen clock. "What's this?" she asked, frowning. "Open it." She did, and as the photos and papers spilled out, her face went pale. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but no words came out. "How long has it been going on?" I asked, my voice steady. "James, she began, but I cut her off. "Don't lie to me, Jenna. I know everything." Tears welled in her eyes, and for a moment, I thought she might beg for forgiveness. Instead, she went on the defensive. "You don't understand," she said. I felt neglected. "You've been so busy with work, with the kids." I needed. "Don't you dare blame this on me," I snapped. "I gave you everything, Jenna. Everything. And this is how you repay me." Her tears turned to anger. "You don't know what it's like to feel invisible in your own marriage." I stood, my chair scraping against the floor. "You made yourself invisible the moment you decided to betray me. And now, you're going to face the consequences." She sobbed as I walked away, but I didn't look back. The storm had begun, and there was no turning back now. Jenna's betrayal felt like a wound that refused to heal, and her reaction to being confronted only made it worse. The excuses, the deflection, the tears, they were all weapons she wielded to justify her actions. But I wasn't about to let her rewrite the narrative. This was her mess, and she was going to clean it up. The morning after our confrontation, she tried to salvage the situation, pleading with me at the breakfast table. "James, please," she said, her voice trembling. "I know I messed up, but we can work through this. Think about the kids, the life we've built. Don't throw it all away." I sipped my coffee, staring at her through the steam rising from the mug. "You already threw it away, Jenna. I'm just dealing with the fallout." She flinched, as if the words physically struck her. But instead of pressing further, she fell silent. Maybe she sensed that no amount of begging would fix what she'd broken. That evening, I called Lisa. It wasn't an easy decision, but she deserved to know the truth about her husband. I hesitated before dialing her number, my thumb hovering over the screen. When she picked up, her voice was cheerful, unsuspecting. "Hi, James. What a surprise." "Lisa," I began, my voice heavy. "We need to talk. It's about Mark." There was a pause on the other end, and I could hear her breath hitch. "What about him?" "I think it's best if we meet in person," I said. This isn't a conversation to have over the phone. We agreed to meet at a nearby cafe the next morning. When I arrived, Lisa was already there, sitting at a corner table, her hands wrapped tightly around a mug of tea. She looked up as I approached, her face pale and anxious. "James," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What's going on?" I sat down, placing the manila envelope on the table between us. "I'm sorry to do this, but you need to see it for yourself." She hesitated before opening it, her hands shaking. As the photos and call logs spilled out, her eyes widened in disbelief. Tears welled up, and she quickly wiped them away, trying to compose herself. I can't believe this," she whispered. "How long?" "At least a few months," I said. "Maybe longer." Lisa sat back, staring at the evidence. "He said he was working late, helping a friend fix their car." "All lies." "I know how it feels," I said quietly. "I'm sorry." She nodded, her jaw tightening. "Thank you for telling me. I don't know what I'll do yet, but I needed to know." The fallout began almost immediately. Lisa confronted Mark that night, and from what I heard through the grapevine, it wasn't pretty. Mark moved out within days, leaving Lisa with their house and a mountain of questions. Meanwhile, Jenna and I were locked in a cold war at home. Every conversation was clipped, every interaction laced with tension. The kids started to notice. Emma, our oldest, cornered me in the kitchen one night. "Dad, what's going on with you and Mom?" I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "Your mom and I are going through a tough time right now, sweetie. But no matter what happens, we both love you and your brother very much." She frowned, her eyes searching mine. "Are you getting a divorce?" The word hung in the air like a thundercloud. I crouched down to her level, placing my hands on her shoulders. "We're figuring things out, okay? I promise we'll always be here for you." She nodded reluctantly, but I could see the worry etched on her face. It broke my heart. Jenna tried to repair the damage in her own way, but her efforts felt hollow. She started cooking elaborate dinners, leaving sweet notes on the bathroom mirror, and even suggesting we go to couples therapy. But I wasn't interested in pretending everything was fine. "Therapy?" I said one night as we stood in the kitchen. "You think a few sessions with a counselor are going to erase what you did?" "I'm trying, James," she said, her voice rising. "I'm trying to make things right. Doesn't that count for something?" "What counts," I snapped, "is that you chose to betray me. And now you're trying to patch it up like it's a leaky pipe." Her shoulders slumped, and for a moment, she looked utterly defeated. But I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. Not anymore. The final nail in the coffin came a week later. Jenna's phone buzzed on the counter while she was in the shower. It was Mark. I didn't plan to look, but curiosity got the better of me. The message was brief: "I miss you. When can we talk?" I stared at the screen, my anger simmering. Despite everything, she was still in contact with him. Still clinging to whatever fantasy they'd built together. When Jenna emerged from the bathroom, her hair wrapped in a towel, I handed her the phone. "Mark texted," I said coldly. "Seems like he misses you." Her face drained of color. "James, I..." "Save it," I said, cutting her off. "I'm done, Jenna. I'm calling the lawyer tomorrow." Her tears came quickly, but I didn't stay to watch. I walked out of the room, my mind already focused on the next steps. This wasn't just the end of our marriage, it was the beginning of my freedom. The house was eerily quiet after I told Jenna I was filing for divorce. The usual hum of family life, the kids laughing, the distant sound of the television, the clatter of dinner plates, seemed to vanish overnight. Even Emma and Liam, our youngest, seemed to tread more carefully, their voices subdued as if they could sense the fragile thread holding everything together was about to snap. Jenna, for her part, was a ghost of herself. The confident, vibrant woman I'd married had been replaced by someone I barely recognized. She moved through the house like a shadow, her eyes red and puffy from crying. Her efforts to reconcile, dinners, notes, therapy suggestions, had ceased entirely. It was as if she'd accepted that this was the end. I spent the next week preparing for the divorce. The lawyer assured me everything was airtight. I'd secured the house, the majority of our savings, and primary custody of the kids. Jenna would be left with visitation rights and a small settlement. It felt cold, calculated, but I couldn't afford to let emotions guide me anymore. One night, I found myself in the garage, sitting in the SUV where I'd first discovered the packet of condoms that set everything in motion. It felt fitting, somehow, to come full circle. I turned the key in the ignition, letting the engine hum softly, and stared out at the empty street. A part of me ached. Not for Jenna, but for the life we'd built. The holidays, the birthdays, the quiet moments on the couch after the kids were asleep, all of it felt like another world now, one I couldn't return to. I stayed there for hours, lost in thought, until the cold forced me back inside. The next morning, I woke to the sound of Emma pounding on my bedroom door. Her voice was shrill, panicked. "Dad! It's Mom! Something's wrong." I threw on a robe and ran down the hallway to the master bathroom. The door was ajar, and inside, Jenna lay slumped on the floor, her face pale and lifeless. An empty bottle of pills was on the counter, the label half obscured by her shaking hand. "Jenna!" I shouted, dropping to my knees beside her. Her chest rose and fell faintly, but her skin was cold, her lips tinged blue. I shook her gently, my voice breaking. "Jenna, stay with me. Don't you dare leave like this." Emma stood frozen in the doorway, her hands clasped over her mouth. "Call 911. I barked, and she ran to grab the phone. Minutes felt like hours as I held Jenna in my arms, begging her to stay awake. Her eyes fluttered open briefly, and she looked at me, her expression a mixture of sorrow and regret. "I'm sorry," she whispered, barely audible. "Don't do this," I said, tears streaming down my face. "You don't get to leave us like this. You don't get to leave the kids." The ambulance arrived, its wailing siren cutting through the stillness of the morning. The paramedics worked quickly, lifting Jenna onto a stretcher and rushing her to the hospital. I followed in my car, my mind a whirlwind of guilt and anger. At the hospital, I paced the waiting room, my hands trembling. Emma sat silently in a chair, her face buried in her hands. Liam, thankfully, was still asleep at home, oblivious to the chaos unfolding. After what felt like an eternity, a doctor approached. Her face was grim, and I braced myself for the worst. "She's stable," the doctor said, and I felt a wave of relief. But, she was very close. Another hour, and we might not have been able to save her. I nodded, swallowing hard. "Can I see her?" "She's conscious, but weak. Keep it brief." When I entered the room, Jenna was lying in the bed, her face pale against the stark white sheets. Her eyes flicked to me as I approached, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. "Why?" I finally asked, my voice cracking. "Why would you do this?" Her eyes filled with tears. "I didn't know how to fix it," she said. "I thought, maybe it would be easier for everyone if I wasn't here." I sat down heavily in the chair beside her bed, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. "The kids need you, Jenna. No matter what's happened between us, they need their mother." "And you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I hesitated, the words caught in my throat. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I can't lose you. Not like this." Jenna's attempt to end her life shook the foundation of everything I thought I knew. The divorce plans were put on hold as she recovered, and for weeks, we lived in a fragile truce. I focused on the kids, trying to shield them from the weight of what had happened, but the tension lingered in every corner of the house. One evening, Jenna sat down across from me at the dining table, her hands trembling. "I want to try again," she said. "Not just for the kids, but for us." I looked at her, searching for the woman I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. She was there, buried beneath the pain and regret. But I wasn't sure if it was enough. "I don't know if we can," I said honestly. "Too much has happened." She nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "But will you try?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I reached across the table and took her hand, holding it tightly. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was something. And in that moment, it was all we had.